regenerative agriculture has the ability to sequester about half to potentially all of the emissions that humanity is releasing on a yearly basis. Organic farms, at least, compared to conventional, tend to have more than 50% more species abundance. Regenerative ag has the ability to produce more nutrient-dense food. It also has the ability to bring more money back to rural communities. Regenerative agriculture is multifaceted, it's complex, but it's also the only logical thing to do. And that's where, I find hope that I think regenerative ag is inevitable.
Hey folks, I'm Conor Gaughan, and welcome to Consensus in Conversation, a podcast where we're talking to the innovators, entrepreneurs, and thought leaders who are committed to building successful businesses that also help us build a better world. When I first began thinking about creating this podcast, the seed at its core was to explore and maybe prove to myself a key belief that I'd begun to develop during my time in the financial sector. That if capital represents nothing so much as the ability to affect change, there's just as much reason to believe the change can be for the better as for the worse. The wealth contained in the world's capital markets is a genuinely massive force. Working head down on making deals in those markets, or from the perspective of an external investor, it's sometimes easy to get focused on relative stats, like points or percentage change. You forget how ridiculously massive some of the actual real numbers are. The current world's most valuable company, Apple, has a market capitalization of around $3.57 trillion, all by itself. There are only 5 countries on Earth that have a GDP larger than that: the US, China, Japan, Germany, and India. That's it. Or if you want to talk about actual revenue instead of just on-paper value, take the world's largest company by revenue, Walmart. In 2023, Walmart's total revenue was $611 billion. That places it right between Spain and Australia in terms of annual revenue. And what can be done with that kind of wealth? Well, obviously, any corporation, publicly traded or otherwise, has very different obligations and objectives from a nation-state in terms of how it utilizes capital. But for the sake of continuing the comparison, let's measure the revenue against annual government expenditures. The annual expenditure of the Netherlands, for example, is around $464 billion. For that amount, it provides a population of about 18 million people, a highly robust social security system, military defense, infrastructure, including roads, bridges, EV charging stations, and subsidization of housing construction, poverty relief measures, public education, and substantial investment in the development of sustainable energy projects. In other words, Walmart's annual revenue could support a population of 18 million people at the 10th highest standard of living in the world per the Human Development Index, and still run a surplus of $147 billion. What I'm suggesting here is that such amounts of capital represent enormous capacity to do stuff, to build useful things, hire people for necessary work, to provide those in need. Money makes the world go round, but there's no inherent reason that it needs to be a bad thing. Pure potential is always neutral. Everything depends on how you use it. It's not exactly a business school secret that wherever a problem exists, there's money to be made solving it. To take an example following our most recent conversation, look at a company like Waste Management. They provide a highly necessary service hauling trash and operating recycling facilities for municipalities. They operate at a profit doing it, and they're able to return a decent dividend to their investors. Life is improved by having our trash dealt with, and both the folks running the company and those providing it the capital it needs to operate get rewarded. As far as I'm concerned, that's what all of capitalism both can and should look like. If capital is going to wield the kind of immense power that it does by virtue of its capacity to make things happen, then we can use that power to make the world a better place. We don't even really have to sacrifice a good return to do it. Most of the time, all it really requires is a bit more patience on our time horizon, and perhaps a bit more creativity in how we sell our solutions. And exploring that kind of creativity and how to use capital to improve our world is part of the reason why I started this podcast. The other part is that I love to nerd out with founders about the cool things they're building. But I always come back to the role that capital can and needs to play in creating a more sustainable future. Which is why it's such a pleasure to encounter a kindred spirit like my guest today. Brandon Welch is the co-founder and CEO of Mad Capital, a financial firm dedicated to supplying farmers with capital they need to make the transition to regenerative agriculture. As frequent listeners will know by now, one of my other big passions on the show is regenerative agriculture. So when I first read about the work Brandon is doing to enable and accelerate the transition across our agricultural system, I knew he'd be the perfect match for the podcast. Brandon's had a fascinating journey to co-founding Mad Capital, in quite a literal sense, as you'll hear from him. And I'm totally inspired by the mission he's undertaken, alongside his colleagues at Mad, to be the instrument by which America's farmers future-proof our food system. There's so much awesome wisdom to be harvested. Sorry, I had to do it in his approach. So without further ado, let's jump into the conversation. Let's, I guess, start with the easiest question of all. Can you give us your name, your company, and your title?
Sure. I'm Brandon Welch, CEO and co-founder of Mad Capital, and we are working to create a regenerative organic revolution in agriculture. So we're a lender to regenerative organic farmers.
Before we get into the story of Madcap, I kind of want to just start with your story. So where are you from originally?
Yeah, I grew up just south of Boston, a little town called West Bridgewater, a town of about 6,000 or 7,000 people. Kind of grew up a normal urban childhood, but fortunately had an outlet up in New Hampshire where my family had a cabin as I was growing up. And we'd go up skiing and snowboarding, fly fishing, spending a lot of time outdoors. That was my gateway to the outdoors as a kid, despite growing up in suburbia.
Yeah. So outdoors were always a big part of your life.
Yeah, for sure. And then when I graduated high school and I went to UVM, I ended up studying environmental science and mechanical engineering. And while at Vermont, I really kind of found myself in the outdoors. I ended up hiking the Long Trail, which is a 273-mile trail that bisects the state of Vermont. And I was part of the outdoor club. I'd spend most weekends snowboarding with friends or, going out and finding a local kind of watering hole. There's all sorts of these legendary swimming holes located throughout Vermont. So I've spent, a lot of my kind of formative years in the outdoors and then ended up venturing out to Colorado where, I'd spend quite a bit of time.
Yeah,
outside.
Where I was raised. We traded.
Yeah. Where were you raised in Colorado again?
Raised mostly in Littleton, and then in high school, my folks moved a bit further west to the Golden area. Although now it feels like, now it's just the suburbs. But when I was there, it was a little more removed.
Yeah. Golden, the Wild West of Denver.
Yeah.
Right?
Did you always know that you wanted to study environmental science? Like, was that something that was clear from your choice to go to UVM or?
It wasn't clear. No, when I first went to school, I studied mechanical engineering, and I was doing that for the first 3 semesters at UVM. And I started getting this feeling internally of feeling just a little constrained, and like the rigid agenda and schedule that had been laid out to me for my entire college curriculum had very little flexibility, and feeling like I just wasn't really expressing any form of creativity and plodding away with Calc 2 and thermodynamics and statics and, in MATLAB, spending hours on end coding away from my engineering degree. I decided I wanted to explore, other majors. And as I was going through that shift, it was between economics or environmental science because I really liked, the underpinnings of both, either, save the planet or understand how kind of money is made and how it works. And I ended up making the decision to switch to environmental science because of my experience in the outdoors when I was growing up. And then right after I made that decision, that's when I hiked the Long Trail and took 3 weeks to backpack with a few of my best buddies. And that really sealed the deal. Just being totally committed to living out in nature for 3 weeks and, surviving off of peanut butter and olive oil and just trying to make it through to the other side. And it's in those moments of kind of quiet and also being entirely focused on just one task, putting one foot in front of the other, where I decided that I had made the right choice and I wanted to focus, at least in my career, on some way of supporting the planet, the environment. I wasn't exactly sure where I would end up or what that would look like, but I've always wanted to feel like I'm contributing and doing something meaningful and somehow doing something that really does matter. And, to me, that's the thing that's resonated most.
I want to dig in on this foreshadowing though a little bit, because it wasn't just that you were thinking about an economics degree. This was, another pastime of yours. You were a member of the investment club at UVM, right? So like, not that one needs to reconcile a passion for finance with a passion for the outdoors, but they're not necessarily things that you always see coupled together. And so I'm curious how you kind of thought about those two sides of your experience in school.
It's hard to say. When I was maybe 12 or 13, I remember sitting down with my grandfather and he was educating me on how to invest into the stock market and to even just take, these small little bits of money that I was making mowing lawns around my neighborhood and to just start saving now. And that's a hard message to get across to a kid. I wish I had started, saving some of that lawn mowing money at that point now. But, he was trying to educate me on compounding and, how the stock market generally worked. And for some reason that attracted me. I don't know if it's the nature of making more money from the capital you already have, an aspect of maybe gambling. It just seems kind of exciting. I think why a lot of people are excited by finance and the stock market generally. And, when I was 16, I actually opened an account and started buying and selling stocks. And I was doing all these, like micro levered trades with penny stocks and such. And at that point, that was more just the game of trying to make a little bit of money versus understanding fundamental economics and like deeper philosophy around, wealth creation and true wealth creation beyond just financial, but looking at societal and carbon wealth and biodiversity and all these other forms that it's now turned into. But it's something that I think I've always been attracted to just from people that I've been surrounded by, whether it was my grandfather educating me on the stock market or my dad having started and run a couple of small businesses throughout his career, something that I've gravitated towards.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting. I think one of the themes we explore or have explored over the past year or so is for those that can identify opportunities for the capital markets to engage in positive social impact, it actually brings this like leverage, this superpower potentially to making positive change if it's harnessed correctly. I mean, I think, again, we're going to talk a lot about MAD because I think you're a great example of that. But even folks like the New York Stock Exchange who've been looking at natural asset companies and trying to figure out ways that the market can bring its power and scale to bear for positive social impact. It's not always the default posture of folks in the environmental community, but I think it's an important perspective to bring to the table.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, I've always wanted to do something that matters, that's meaningful. And not that I'm trying to create a legacy or necessarily leave something behind. I would like to leave the world better than I found it. And, I always take kind of a framing of looking at myself both from the future as if I'm, 80 years old and on my front porch and, drinking a coffee. I imagine myself in that position and would like to be making decisions today that would make that person proud. But then also at the same time, I imagine my 10 or 15-year-old self wondering if what I'm doing today would be exciting and enticing even for, a 10-year-old. So if I can both make my 10-year-old self and my 80-year-old self proud of the work that I'm doing today, it feels like the perfect blend of, playfulness and fun and creativity and excitement, also blended with trying to create deep, meaningful impact that I knew that I did the work that I should have been doing during the crises of our time in order to, help steward the next generation. And I've always had that mindset, and trying to, live in that zone can be a tension, but it can also be a guiding light to making sure that, I'm focusing my energies in a way that give me fulfillment on a daily basis.
I mean, that's the dream, I think, especially it seems like it's very much the current zeitgeist. It's the dream for a lot of young folks, I think, coming out of college and trying to forge a path. I mean, I guess that would be my next question then. So how did you forge that path and find this serendipitous tension, but also balance?
It was a little bit of luck and being at the right place, the right time, and making some good decisions. But frankly, kind of stumbled into this path. So to back up a little bit, I went to UVM, studied mechanical engineering, switched to environmental science. After I graduated, I ended up biking across the country from Boston to Pacific City, Oregon. Took 54 days, did it with two of my really good buddies. I then moved back to Vermont for a year because my wife is a year younger than me and she was still graduating school. When she graduated, we decided we wanted to venture out west, having both grown up in Massachusetts and just kind of had an East Coast mindset. We wanted to go west and see what was out there. So we ended up packing up the truck and built out a little bed in the back, built out our living quarters, and we ended up driving to Boulder, Colorado, where we had a few friends. Started there, ended up doing a 4-month road trip all across the western half of the US. And we were looking for, what was next and where we wanted to kind of root down and start our lives. And during that process, as we were doing this cross-country road trip, I decided if I wanted to have a non-conventional career, I needed a reason to talk to people who had kind of made something of themselves. And I thought a great excuse to do that was actually to start a podcast. So I went to Best Buy, I bought a microphone, bought a little recording kit. And when I was on the road, whenever we land in a city, I started interviewing different like sustainability officers and people who had positions that I looked up to that I thought maybe I could grow into. And I only ended up getting through about 4 of these interviews because by that point, the first person I had interviewed based here in Boulder, he had actually sent me an internship opportunity to work at a group called Natural Capitalism Solutions. And as I was starting this podcast, I was reading this book called Smart Cuts by Shane New. And he talks a lot about instead of trying to go through the front door, which is where most people try to go, you got to find the side door. You have to find a side entrance. If you try to go where everybody goes, you're going to get lost in the noise. So you've got to try to find a way in that's non-conventional, that's unusual. You got to try to find the back door. So I thought between the podcast, this internship, maybe something would come of this. And that's what ultimately was the launching pad that's gotten me to MAD. That internship ended up turning into a job where I was managing a small carbon fund based here in Colorado. And then through that work, I was able to meet Phil, my co-founder, and we decided to build MAD together. But that journey was not clear even months or weeks ahead of kind of each individual decision. That I think because I was kind of open to receiving these different forms of luck and kind of pathways that were opening up for me, was able to navigate ultimately to meeting Phil, my co-founder, and standing up MAD over the last 6 years.
It's always so much easier to connect the dots looking backwards, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it is. It is.
I mean, let's stick on all these adventures for a second, because I think between the long trail, cycling across the country, living 4 months out of your truck, traveling the country. I'm curious. We've had a few conversations with kind of endurance athlete types, and it feels like there's interesting lessons and interesting parallels between the mindset that it takes to persevere and sustain and succeed in those environments and business and entrepreneurship. I'm curious if any parallels come to mind, any analogies that you think are worth pointing out.
Oh, totally. And I wasn't aware of some of these parallels until I then took a moment to reflect on some of those adventures. And, a couple that come to mind was biking across the country, going from Boston and starting that, one morning, and me and the 2 guys I did it with, I dipped a little vial on the beach and picked up a little sand from Boston, and I was going to carry it all the way to Pacific City, Oregon. And starting out on this adventure that almost seems unsurmountable and huge and scary, and I had no clue what we were going to encounter along the way. The parallels that I see with business is that, after we started biking and we got through day 1, and then we, woke up, got on our bikes, got through day 2, and then started getting into a pattern, it just became life. You wake up, you ride your bike, you eat a lot of food, you drink water, you set up your tent and, hope to not get caught by the cops. You go to sleep and then you do it again. And it's amazing how far you can go in a little amount of time with consistency and having the right habits in place. And biking across the country, even in the moment of biking, seemed almost impossible in some ways. But, looking back over the course of weeks and then a couple of months, we had made it across the entire United States. And that felt like an incredible feat that even now, looking back, seems like a really large challenge that would be hard to go and, repeat again. But I think just the lesson that I now take into day-to-day activities is to just keep going, to just have the grit of putting one foot in front of the other, doing the right things, making the right decisions, and being ready to be, set back. I mean, in business, it's constantly 2 steps forward, 1 foot back. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward, 4 steps back. And being able to, continue to fight and have the motivation is important. And it's one thing that I've really been learning and personally just going through over the last few years is getting comfortable with the fact that business is a roller coaster and there's always ups and downs, and knowing that, when you're at the bottom of a trough and nothing seems to be going right, that eventually it may even be the next day. It could be a few weeks from now that things will get better, but it's a matter of you got to keep going to see that things do get better. And when you're at the top, that's not going to last either. Things are going to get hard again.
Yeah. The other curiosity, I mean, we were joking before we started recording, but I think I've spent at least a couple days on the road the last 6 weeks all over the place. And we've, in the past, Consensus has done a great digital doc series called Made in America, where we've been on the road in communities across the country. I'm curious, as you both biked across the country and drove living out of the back of the truck for a while,
Yep.
one of the things that stands out to me is just how, despite so many differences in communities, there is so much that unites us as a country, as
Yep.
humans. I don't know, I'm curious kind of what your experience was, what learnings you came away from those travels with, what reflections about, the country you might mention coming out of that.
Yeah. One reflection on, having been to so many different places and met so many different types of people in different communities is how similar people are. Whether you meet somebody in the middle of Arkansas or Texas or Colorado or Massachusetts, people are much more similar than they are different, regardless of where they come from or how they grew up. They want many of the same things in life. They want to have a good job. They want to have loving friends and family. They want to be healthy. And in my travels across the country, I've seen that time and time again. And I think because of both that experience and then also working with farmers on a regular basis, I'm always filled with, I think, hope and how much actually does unite us versus the media's story in terms of how divided we are and a lot of the challenges that we face in modern day politics. But I've never felt, I think because of those experiences, any sort of hatred or divide towards like the other side, whatever that means.
Right.
Because I know whether it's like drinking a beer with my uncles who might believe in different political views as me, or doing the same thing with a farmer in Minnesota. I mean, most people, like within the norm, like 80% of the population, they can get along and talk about any types of topics, even if they disagree. And that's really encouraging to me, because despite what you see in the media, I think there's a lot of common ground that we can find amongst one another. And that's something that inspires me about food, and something that has kept me coming back is food is this ultimate kind of center point of society, because people get around the table 3 times a day, and their food is something that can unite folks of any sort of opinion or view. And you can just talk about the food. You don't even have to talk about anything that might be, divisive or political. It's just like, this is some damn good barbecue. And we're just going to talk about how great Johnny did at cooking up, these baby back ribs that we're eating now, right? So, I think there's a lot of hope.
Yeah. And it does all come down to barbecue, though, I will say. Barbecue has a special place in that nexus, I think.
I would agree with that.
Let's get into the story of Matt. So, I guess start with just the origin story. Give us, where did the idea come from?
Mm-hmm.
When did you and your co-founder begin to think about this concept of, a financial organization that could help farmers transition into regenerative ag?
Yeah, so Matt has kind of a broader story. So Phil, my co-founder, was already working on Matt Agriculture before I had met him. First, it was kind of a bug feed company where he was growing chicken feed that was more regenerative and organic compared to, what you typically find. And he then pivoted that into wanting to create Matt Ag as kind of a community platform, which was really going to act as the gel in the container to have hard conversations around food systems and agriculture. And I had met him as he was coming out of kind of creating Matt Agriculture as a community container and trying to figure out what its next evolution would be. And we had met because I was running a carbon fund, and he was curious how we could get farmers paid for putting carbon in the ground, and thought carbon offsets might be a viable way of creating an incentive for these farms. So we had met and initially began our relationship over that. And we ended up going on quite an exploratory journey together, figuring out how we could try to make a viable carbon market work to transform our food system. And it was during that journey, which happened through 2018 and 2019, where he was building Matt Ag, I was building the Colorado Carbon Fund, that, we thought we were just supporting each other's businesses and we were just going to have a good kind of collaborative relationship, that we actually realized, one, farmers were running up against major issues that were bigger hurdles than just access to carbon dollars. They were running up against problems of access to right financing, access to the right knowledge and education to make on-farm transitions, and access to markets for their crops. They could get a value add for the risk that they were taking. And as we were uncovering those problems, we also recognized that MAD could be a container to help solve for all those. So that's where I decided to dive in headfirst with Phil. And that's where we stood up three different, think of them as sub entities within MAD agriculture to help solve those challenges for producers. So the idea for the financing really started to bubble up in mid 2019 when we were attending various farmer conferences. We were in field talking with tons of producers across the US, and just time and time again, they would talk about the struggles that, their banker would give them a hard time. Their lender would ask them to go, find another financier for next season. They wouldn't be comfortable with the practices they were using. And it was just this continual kind of bubbling up from farmers themselves that finance was an obvious sticking point. And, when you hear something 50 times from 50 different producers, I mean, there's a pattern there that starts to emerge. And that's where we thought there might be something real here. Let's explore a little deeper and see where this goes.
And so today, how would you kind of give the overarching elevator pitch for both, I guess, the umbrella, but then also your focus at MAD Capital?
Yeah, so I'd say MAD is a collection of three different entities that are all working to help farmers transition to regenerative organic agriculture. We solve what we think are the three biggest barriers stopping many farmers from making that transition: access to the right knowledge education to make a change, access to the right crop markets for farmers to get rewarded for the risk that they're taking, and then access to right fit financing to actually fund all of the work. So collectively across all three orgs, we've got about 22 employees. We're operating through farms that are working on about 300,000 acres of farmland, and it's working. This is resonating with communities across the United States, and farmers are making real in-field change because of it. And on the financing side, at MAD Capital, we're a lender to regenerative organic farmers. That's all we do, is think about how to help farmers span that transition from conventional to organic while using regen practices, and to help farmers who have already made that transformation go further faster. And that's where we provide longer term, more flexible financing than what you're going to find from many of the traditional financiers. We can really tune the payment schedule of the loan to the individual cash flow of the farm. And that can really set them up for a more successful transition, and ultimately for the farm to thrive financially into the future in a way that otherwise would be challenging if they were kind of had the shackles of the traditional financial system, which tends to think in much shorter duration timeframes than ecology and nature wants to think, right? Farms don't operate on quarterly earnings cycles. They need to operate on multi-decadal ecological level change. And these things, like growing a tree or growing a chestnut orchard, that'll take you 15 to 20 years. It's not going to happen next season. And it's a matter of balancing what does nature need and what is it calling us to in terms of, natural rates of return, in terms of what it can possibly bear, how much interest can the land actually produce, with the realities of what capital markets and also farmers are demanding of those ecosystems. And MAD Capital is kind of living in the slew of all of those different competing interests and trying to create the right conditions to really benefit all as farmers are making a food system transformation.
You said something which I think is interesting. It's not just that helping farmers thrive in that environment. Like this environment seems to be very dynamic right now. I've seen on your materials that, this is the perfect storm of social, environmental, and economic factors aligning for a major revolution in agriculture. And I'm curious if you would give us an overview of kind of the factors you see and how you understand them. Why do you think now is this tipping point for regenerative?
Over the last 30 to 40 years, as we've gone through hyper industrialization and use of massive amounts of pesticides, biocides, synthetic inputs, and then combining that with the extremely commodified, hyper-competitive industry of conventional agriculture, farmers are at a breaking point where their soil is, washing down the Mississippi, waterways are contaminated. They're seeing family members die from various types of cancer from the use of chemicals they've been using on farm. And it's really hard financially for farmers to make it season to season. It feels as though all of these different factors coming together at once is creating the conditions where farmers are seeking a way out They're looking for an off ramp to exit the industrial complex and to somehow make something of their farm, of their business, and to leave a legacy behind where they did better than what the current system is trying to turn them into being. And I think society at large, beyond what farmers are experiencing, are also calling for that, whether it's the issues that we're facing with climate change or biodiversity or the health crises that Americans are facing. It's the perfect storm of complicating factors where farmers can be the salvation of many of these issues that
Yeah,
society are facing and can act as a modern day hero to be able to solve the problems that we're facing as a species. And some of them are fairly existential, right?
right.
Like if we lose our topsoil, you're not coming back from that next season. It takes thousands of years to build soil.
Reminds me of a conversation I had maybe 2 years ago with an early pioneer in regenerative, but focused on ranching in particular. He said something really
Yeah.
fascinating, which I didn't internalize, but just hearing you say it seems really poignant. He said, there's been this challenge with adoption because if you are a legacy family farmer growing up in a particular industrial process, even if you were ready to jump into the regenerative space, there's this risk return consideration. Like you don't want to be the first in your family or the one in the family that loses the family farm by changing everything, by, reinventing or adopting new methodologies or new processes or new workflows. And so there's this kind of, it's just easier to stay with the status quo and lower risk, certainly lower return. But for legacy family farmers, like that made perfect sense. Feels like now the threats / incentives have shifted enough that that's no longer the risk return profile, 2 or 3 years later, which is interesting.
Agreed. Yeah, we're starting to see enough anecdotes and stories and case studies across the US and the world that regenerative organic agriculture is more profitable than
Yeah.
conventional industrial ag. And even the adoption of very straightforward regenerative practices like cover cropping and minimizing tillage can drive, decrease in yield volatility, can improve water holding capacity on the farm, and can have these benefits that they maybe only result in 5, 10, 15% cost savings, but that can add up over
Yeah.
multiple years, and it can reduce stress on farms. I think there's a lot of calls for the food system to make a massive transformation overnight, but that's entirely unrealistic because
Right.
we're talking about farmers' livelihoods. We're talking about multi-generational legacies. So that's why we really encourage artful and strategic experimentation, where a farm should be thinking about trying this on 1 to 5% of their land one season, and if it's working, then scaling it out over more of their acres and doubling down on what's working.
Right.
But ensuring that they're experimenting and not going whole hog and betting the entire ranch on this is regenerative or bust, that's a recipe for disaster.
You get all the farming metaphors in on that one. I'm curious, what does the average kind of process look like, I guess, for a farmer then? Maybe even start with what's the kind of archetype or profile of the farmers that you're working with now? I know when we
Yeah.
first spoke a few weeks ago, we were talking a little bit about how there's a demographic shift in ag, and you're seeing younger farmers coming into the industry either through family farm inheritance or buying into this industry. So I'm curious kind of how you're thinking about your ideal customer base, and then what's the on-ramp for those folks to work with MAD?
Yeah. We're working right now mostly with 2 to 3,000 acre multi-generational farming operations in the Midwest. So most of our producers, they're growing corn, soybeans, oats, alfalfa. They're experimenting with things like yellow peas, pinto beans, garbanzo beans, heritage varieties of wheat. So think of them as they're growing your typical staple commodities, but then they're also experimenting with some food grade varieties to add more diversity into their rotation or to add perenniality into their rotation. So many of our farms, they've been farming for anywhere from 10 to 30 years. They tend to be a little younger than your average farmer, mid 40s versus late 50s of the average US farmer. They're always experimenting, they're ambitious, they're thinking about how to improve their business. They love a lot of the biodiversity that comes back to their farm after making that change and trying to transition to organic. The profitability is nice. That tends to be almost secondary to a lot of the values-based decisions that they're making. Because many farmers didn't make the change to organic simply to seek profitability. They made it because a family member was sick, because they wanted to see their kids play in the field, and not be worried about, what pesticides they were picking up on their shoes. And, their on-ramp onto us and how they find us tends to be typically, from a neighbor, from a friend, maybe at a conference. All of our farms right now are coming organically, just inbound through word of mouth. And we try to start a relationship with them by getting to know the history of their operation, what they've been working on over the last couple of years, and what their plans are going forward. And through that process, we could start to explore if, we're a right fit partner to help them get there. And there's obviously the nitty gritty of, collecting financials, risk analysis, being able to work on projections together and stress test those and make sure that they're actually, within reason. But the general process is building a relationship to make sure that we're a good partner for one another.
When you think about kind of your approach then as lenders, right? Let's, the product suite
Yep.
that you guys have for folks. Talk us through what that looks like. What's the differentiation / improvement against the traditional or conventional way of ag finance?
Yeah, we really differentiate ourselves in the way that we understand organic transition and farms that have also made a successful transition. So these farms are using different tool sets. So they're not using sprayers. They're using things like no-till drills and roller crimpers and weed zappers and flame weeders. They're usually using different practices, things like cover cropping and minimizing tillage and introducing rye in order to, say, reduce weed pressure in the spring. They're also introducing different crops. They're not just growing corn and soybeans. They're introducing more diversity into their rotation. And all of these additional and different types of ways that a farmer may successfully operate a farm regeneratively and organically, to a traditional lender, those scream risk because there's a lack of understanding, because their perception of what a farm should look like, being growing corn and soybeans and keeping the field clean, if there's any difference between that baseline of what they think a farm should look like and then what these regenerative organic farms are doing, that screams risk to them. And risk is something that they can't get comfortable with because they're not incentivized to. About 1% of all land in the United States at this point is certified organic, and it's growing on a yearly basis, but it's still a very small minority of the overall agricultural system. So if you were to take that and apply it to the number of farms, about 99 out of 100 farmers that walk into the bank and are looking for an operating loan, they're using the same practices, they're using the same equipment, they're selling to the same buyers. And then you have this one, weirdo that's growing food for people, that's growing food in a long-term rotation. And many traditional lenders just can't get comfortable with that because it's different than what they're used to. So one of our big ways that we differentiate is simply in the fact that we understand organic farmers, we understand their practices, and that's what we live and breathe. That's all we do. That's all we think about. And that may seem like it should be easier to get over than what you'd expect, but that is a big cultural divide within the industry right now. And that alone makes us differentiated enough to see business on a daily basis for farms that are being turned away or being given the cold shoulder at their traditional community bank. So we differentiate on both just understanding. On the actual loans we originate, we do quite a bit of interest-only credit, where an IO term note essentially can give the farmer more breathing room by freeing up cash flow on the farm that would otherwise be required to be paid back earlier if they were working with a lender that would only give them shorter-term loans. So the longer-term loan aligns better with the cycles of an organic transition and an organic farm, because they sell their crops over longer marketing periods, and they also have the multi-year trough that they have to navigate if they're transitioning land to certified organic. So that's the second differentiating factor. We also have the two additional MAD entities where we can bring in our nonprofit arm, MAD Agriculture, that helps give farmers agronomic advice, access to in-field research, and access to media and content development. That is a fairly unique program in the ag sector. And then we also have MAD Markets, which is a brokerage and origination company that can help set our farmers up with longer term and higher paid contracts for their crops to ultimately help de-risk some of our lending capital and put that farmer in a better financial position. So those are a few of the factors that differentiate us across just the being a domain expert in organic transition, and after the farms make the transition, being able to come in with an interest only operating loan, and then also bringing in mad agriculture and mad markets to really surround the farm with a family of brands that's entirely aligned with their farming vision and helping remove any of the hurdles that they may face beyond just financial.
Yeah. Flipping the coin for a second, I'm curious, and can't get past, I think, my background as a former banker. What was the process like to be out there raising capital? And like, how are finance folks receiving kind of the story and the return potential and just the structural innovation that you guys are proposing? What was what were those conversations like?
Yeah. And these are active conversations. We are perpetually raising capital, being a lending business. Our product is money, and being able to create our product is through fundraising for it. I wish we could just, get into Jay Powell's back office there and just print, a few off and to be able to make more loans. But we're in a spot where, we have to work fairly hard to create our product. And then we have to go out and actually lend it and do the real work. So the broader capital markets have been receptive to the work that we're doing. However, because of our current scale and because we're a new organization working in a newer sector, there's been some hesitancy to lean in. And what we're seeing is over the last few months in particular, there's been a pretty big shift going from our first fund that we raised in 2021 to having now fully deployed that, stood up a couple of other funding vehicles. We've now been around long enough and made enough loans, and we have a good track record to where we're starting to get looks from much more serious institutions. I'm talking large multi-$100 billion banks, large pension funds, state-backed funding vehicles. All of these different vehicles are starting to take us with a degree of seriousness and starting to, look at our credibility and thinking of this as a viable asset class. But the challenge is, in order to scale AUM in our lending product, we need to have a track record. And in order to have a track record, we need to have assets under management.
Right.
So it becomes this chicken and egg problem where we're always seeking kind of the next wave of adopters and the next wave of investors that are comfortable with our current stage of the business. And eventually, we hope to stair step our way into being able to access much more traditional markets through, securitizations and the issuances of bonds and, partnering up on standard warehouse facilities. But being able to work our way to that is going to take a couple more years of kind of, I think, diligent risk management and portfolio performance. Sometimes being able to raise capital from certain investment partners is simply a product of how long we have been around. They will not have the conversation until our first loan has matured or seasoned for over 5 years. So there's just also a length of time that has to pass for us to have some of those conversations. But, generally, the capital markets are interested in finding differentiated ways of being able to generate yield and get exposure to something that certainly checks all of their ESG boxes across carbon drawdown, water quality, biodiversity, growing healthy food for people, rural economic development. It's pretty attractive from an impact standpoint. However, one of the challenges that we keep coming back to is also the limitations in terms of how high the financial upside can be, because we're talking about agriculture and we're talking about real, natural assets that can't produce 20% year over year returns. It's just physically impossible for that much sunlight to be pumped into a field and for a farmer to convert all that sunlight into value that's going to generate a return that Wall Street may be used to seeking. But on the counter side, these are fairly low risk systems. When you actually have a great operator that has a good track record of being able to produce a crop, they can do that fairly consistently, despite some of the challenges of weather and market dynamics that may put pressure on the individual operator. So because of that, we're also seeing more receptivity in the types of returns that we're offering, which is more high single digits, rather than those kind of mid-teens to upper teens returns that Wall Street is used to seeking.
It also feels like, not that we have to go down a finance rabbit hole, because I will do that. We need to protect ours from doing it. But it also feels, to your point, it feels like there's also a great, like if you're trying to remove beta, this is a great way to do it too, from a portfolio manager's perspective, I would assume.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's entirely uncorrelated,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. So pivoting from the financial impact, let's take a minute and talk about overall the potential kind of environmental impact. So we've had a handful of regenerative farm folks on the show, and I've talked a lot about what their individual impact is for their farm, for their business. But I'm curious, like if you think about the big picture, ag as a sector, the potential for regenerative to kind of move the needle on some of the bigger existential challenges that we've talked about. How do you guys think about the impact case for regenerative ag?
Food systems are fundamental for humanity and society. It's right at the base of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need to be able to reliably grow food that is edible in order to survive and thrive as a species. And right now, agriculture is dependent on extraction and conversion of natural resources into financial resources. And we're digging into the principle. We're taking more than just the interest that the land is willing to produce. And because of that, we've come to this break point where regenerative ag and regeneration could be a viable pathway in order to repair a lot of the destruction that's been done over the last few decades and even centuries. And I think the impact case is fairly strong for where regenerative ag can fit within the mix. On the climactic side of things, there are a lot of numbers that have been thrown out there, but from what I've seen, regenerative agriculture combined with, regenerative timber management has the ability to sequester about half to potentially all of the emissions that humanity is releasing on a yearly basis. This is widely debated, and there are ranges down from a quarter of what we release gigaton wise on a yearly basis to there are some people who think regenerative agriculture can sequester 2 or 3 times what we're emitting on a yearly basis. But generally around that, call it 15 to 20 gigatons per year is what we've seen is kind of falling down the middle of the road. From a biodiversity standpoint, organic farms, at least compared to conventional, tend to have more than 50% more species abundance, 30% more species richness. The lack of synthetic inputs, particularly NPK in organic compared to conventional, ends up resulting in a large improvement in water quality due to the reduction in nitrogen leaching, the ability for us to remove a lot of the eutrophication zones and dead zones that we're seeing at the mouths of our rivers. Regenerative ag has the ability to, at least early data shows that it can produce more nutrient dense food. So we could be talking about delivering the same amount of nutrients and micronutrients to someone's body while consuming less calories. It also has the ability to bring more money back to rural communities, which historically over the last few decades have seen wealth be extracted from rural America and into the coast and into cities, restoring a lot of the communities that have been struggling the last couple decades is important. I think if we want to restore some of the political alignment and remove some of the strife that this country is going through, I think the impact of regenerative agriculture is it's multifaceted, it's complex, but it's also the only logical thing to do. If humanity depends on reliably producing food, and right now we are reliably producing food that is killing us and killing the planet, we need to invert that. And regenerative agriculture is that inversion and has the ability to restore our lands, to restore biodiversity and sequester carbon and grow healthy food for people. It's the only path forward if we want to think about living any sort of a healthy lifestyle, if we want to have an environment that, we want to be able to interact with and, an environment that can support human life over, the next 10,000 years of agriculture. It's the logical and viable way to take the food system. And fortunately, I think we have reached that tipping point where that's now being recognized across a variety of the big brands, financiers, and also farmers. And we're seeing the transition to a more regenerative food system because there isn't another pathway. And that's where, I find hope that I think regenerative ag is inevitable.
That was going to be kind of my last meaty question. It's just, where do you find hope? When the stakes are high and the headlines are often grim, how do you rally that hope and optimism to keep on keeping on?
I'm a big believer in humanity. I think humans are the most creative, hardworking, natural entrepreneurs that are out there. We are ready to take on challenges. And because we have been a highly dynamic and the most adaptable species, we've gotten to where we are. I do not think that's going to stop. Despite the challenges we've created for ourselves over the last 100 years, I think we also have the ingenuity to be able to figure a way to the other side and to be able to do so in a way that's going to also bring along nature this time. I think we are finally seeing the value of things, such as consistent rainfall or being able to, build a city in a viable location from the coast, or being able to, grow healthy food for folks, or the value in just, a bird migration. And I see that whether it's, looking at technology that's advancing rapidly, AI, a lot of the hardware, like, SpaceX just recently landed, their large Starship, which was, an incredible feat. I think we're finally starting to see the importance of nature and, real forms of wealth. And fortunately, because we're seeing that importance, we're putting a lot more focus, a lot more money, and a lot more time into it. We are going to see our way through it. It's going to be messy and it's going to take some time and it's not going to be a straight line. But I am an optimist about humanity's future. Humanity will be around the next 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 years. I think we've hit escape velocity. I think, there may be some sort of a Fermi's paradox, coming that we haven't yet anticipated. But I think we are going to continually improve and get better, despite even some of our own natural, innate challenges with being human. We're going to get through this and we're going to come to the other side. And that keeps me going.
I like it. I like that vision. Where should folks go to find out more? Where can we send people to connect with you and MAD?
Yeah, they can learn more at madcapital.com, or they could send me an email, brandon@madcapital.com. Feel free to reach me there. Also on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me and send me a message if you want to get in touch.
Awesome. We'll make sure all those links are in the show notes. Thanks so much for an awesome conversation today and for leaving us with a nice, optimistic, hopeful vision for what could be if we continue working hard to remedy some of this and continue on the path we're working towards.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor. I really appreciate you having me.
Huge thanks to Brandon Welch for joining us on Consensus in Conversation. As Brandon mentioned, you can learn more about Mad Capital and their work at their website, madcapital.com. And you can connect with Brandon either on his LinkedIn, or if you have more specific questions, you can reach out to him via email at brandon@madcapital.com. As always, you can email us at cic@consensus-digital.com. That's cic@consensus-digital.com. You can message me directly on LinkedIn and Threads at CK Gaughan. That's at CKGONE. Send us your questions, comments, or ideas for future guests. We love getting your feedback. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a second to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It's so helpful with growing our reach and adding new people to the conversation. It helps us to continue bringing you more awesome talks with the business leaders you want to hear from. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back next week with a brand new conversation. Consensus in Conversation is hosted by me, Conor Gaughan, and executive produced by me and Jeff Rock. Our producer is Will Gatchell, with editing by the team at Reasonable Volume. Special thanks to the Consensus team, including creative director Kate Tucker and Greg Harrigal on research. Consensus in Conversation is a podcast by Consensus Digital Media, produced in association with Reasonable Volume.